All right. So we are here today with Dr. Christi McGeorge to talk about her work. She's done a lot of research and training around being LGBT affirming. So thank you so much for your willingness to come and chat.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And so you are up at North Dakota State. And how's the weather? I feel like I always need to lead with that in the northern states.
Well, it's beautiful and sunny here today. We had an unusually warm yesterday and got up into the 70s, but I hear we're headed to the 40s by the end of this week for highs. So this is definitely a turning point, but today it's beautiful and sunny and the fall leaves are such great colors.
Oh, good. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I'm from Minnesota originally, so asking about the weather is just the first thing you do every time you talk to somebody. And I just wanted to start with some sort of broad question about some of what you learned over the years about this work and about what's important for new MFTs to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I entered into my career at a kind of an interesting time. Certainly the field was talking about more about those with a marginalized sexual orientation. We weren't really talking about those with a marginalized gender identity, but we were talking about, as I started, though I got nothing in my own training on working with lesbian, bisexual, and gay students in either my master's or my PhD, but there was some literature out there that was accessible and you could read. And so there was definitely a conversation going on. And I think about some of those early studies I did and the reaction they got, even to the point that a partner of an AMFT president called my university asking to shut down one of my studies because she thought it was unethical to even be asking therapists about their beliefs. A study that I was doing with some colleagues. And of course, the IRB said, are you a participant with a complaint in this study? Because that's what IRBs deal with, our institutional review boards. And she said, no, I would never participate in this study. And they said, well, then you don't have an ethical concern. This research can go forward. And as it went on, her partner ended up, who was then the president of AMFT, ended up calling my department head and talking to him about shutting down the study of mine. That was just a survey. It was a simple survey. This is the olden days, so I was mailing them out. We were mailing paper surveys out and things like that and passing them out at conference with envelopes to mail them back. And my department head at the time was just amazing and stood by me and said, no, she's allowed to ask these questions. There's nothing unethical about asking about people's views. So I had the modern homophobia scale in there and the clinical competency scale and asked people actually about what we then called reparative therapy. Again, such an offensive name, even for the practice. We could deconstruct that in many ways, but that's what it was referred to at that point. And I asked about refusal or referral of LGBT clients. At that point, we just were focused on sexual orientation, as was the theme. But you think about that someone, and I was just this little assistant professor, I was a baby assistant professor, and that you could have that sort of response. And now I think if you read the articles that came out of that data, or when my students used to read them, they would be like, oh, these are cute. It was kind of quaint to them that I asked these questions in class. Like, it didn't seem controversial or earth-shattering, but at that time, the field was, there were many people that had been doing that work for a long time, and I had the privilege of following. I don't mean that, but it was controversial, and it was sort of crazy to ask these questions. And now I think the questions that I was asking back then, students can look at and say, well, they were a bit simple. Well, that doesn't seem very controversial. And so because, for instance, in those questions, I wasn't asking about gender identity, so I was excluding a community because it felt like asking about sexual orientation was so much. And so I think we've just seen such a change in what we have conversations about. But as you pointed out, I think about that first data collection. And I think today I'm still talking about, now we're using different language. We talk about sexual orientation change efforts and gender identity change efforts, but I'm still researching those horrific practices. And
Right.
I'm still collecting data and talking about this idea of referral or refusal.
Mhm.
And so some of the topics continue, and some of them we know enough about. So there's new questions to ask.
Sure.
But I look at the students that are doing work around like polyamorous relationships, which should have been being talked about back then, but we weren't even having that conversation.
Mhm.
And you can just see this progression, and who we're willing to see as therapists literally talk about in our scholarly work, and who we continue to just ignore. And getting to see that shift in my career has been awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Things have thankfully changed a lot. And then in some cases stayed the same. So
Yeah,
I have people, students in particular, but sort of young people who go, well, that reparative therapy thing doesn't happen anymore. And I'm like, yeah, it does.
yeah,
Because we did a survey 2016, and 25% of the 400 people had been through something like that. And it sort of blew my students' minds, but I was like, we've come far, and yet this still occurs.
yeah. And I think it's acknowledging the movement that's happened, but that there are, you know, sexual orientation change efforts or gender identity change efforts are very much happening and are scarring and harming people today.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and that's why we need to keep talking about them. And
mhm.
I wish I want to live in a post change effort world where these things never happen and are completely illegal,
Right.
and are banned by all our major mental health organizations. But we're not there yet. But
Yeah.
I can totally imagine how hard it is for many people to think that these practices happen on a daily basis across the US. I
Right.
mean, even in my most recent data collection, 1 in 20 clinical fellows, and this was about 900 folks, thought it was like change efforts were still ethical to practice.
Wow.
I mean, I'm sorry, actually, it was 1 in 5 thought it was ethical, 1 in 20 said they had practiced it.
Wow.
And,
That's a big
and
number.
so that's,
And I would have guessed.
yeah. And so we have to, I wish we could be done with some of these questions, like some of those early questions that maybe Assistant Professor Christi asked, I wish weren't relevant, but they're still relevant today.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. So in doing that kind of early research, how do you think that's informed you in terms of like building on that and beginning sort of put together what it means to be the opposite of that, to be affirming, to be a different kind of therapist
Yeah,
when LGBT people show up in our offices?
yeah. I mean, I think I'm so grateful for that very first project and for what has happened since, because I think um, it's made me think about therapy in such a different way. It fits my own commitments to social justice and feminist practices. But all of this research has shaped me to really challenge myself to think about things. And my thinking hasn't been able to stay constant. Even how we understand, we can talk about affirmative therapy, which is really important, but that definition, even in my writing over the years, has shifted. And we have to tell you, talking about, affirmative means for me at this point, acknowledging the immense harm that heterosexism, sexual minority prejudice, transphobia does to people. We have to start there. That's a basic. And then I don't think we're talking about accepting people's sexual orientation and gender identity. I think we need to be talking about celebrating them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a long time, if I could just get therapists, it models what I think others have done around working with parents. I think my focus was on getting people to be less rejecting initially. It was a sad goal. It wasn't the goal I wanted to have, but at least if people could move to being less rejecting, we could do less harm. It's sort of as the literature's talked about with parents. Initially, the focus with parents of queer kids was to help them be less rejecting,
Mm-hmm.
because even that would prevent suicide. In my case, I was hoping harm with therapists. And then you wanted to move them to being accepting. Then maybe we talked about being inclusive. But
Mm,
I think now in our world, we need to be at a place of celebratory. Like
yeah.
it's not okay to say, I accept you for it, but it's still not right. It's not okay to say, I'll include you and not kick you out of therapy or out of my support group. How do we celebrate? I think that's what we need to talk about with affirmative therapy. And I think years of doing this work has helped me make that progression.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're reminding me when I was in it's my master's or my PhD program. One of the professors talked about what you were just describing there. Like, think about the people and the things we celebrate, and think about the things we don't. Think about the things we tolerate. We're not going to hurt you. You can exist, but we won't be celebrating your marriage or your family or your whatever, right? So that if you think about that I remember my mind going, oh my gosh, like, yeah, like I hadn't really considered, I was still sort of in that phase of like, oh, we're all equal, it's cool, like, like I was, humanistic,
Yeah.
blah. But then you start thinking about what gets celebrated. I think that's a great way of moving the needle, like really thinking about this in a different way.
Yeah, because I mean, we should find a way to celebrate every client that walks into our offices. I'm not saying we celebrate every choice, because there's moments where, whether it's heterosexism, sexism, racism, sexism, gets us to make destructive choices.
Sure.
But how people identify should be celebrated. Identity should be celebrated. And I think ultimately, as clinicians, we need to know how to do that. How do we celebrate our clients' identities so that they can celebrate their? Isn't that the ultimate goal of therapy? Is to walk out of the therapy room saying, I want to celebrate all of who I am.
Right. I mean, yeah, isn't that one of the main goals we have for most people, that they feel worthwhile, that they have a sense of, I like the term self-compassion as opposed to self-esteem, but like they feel the sense of compassion and goodness in them. And aren't we looking for that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Perfectly said.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, that's a huge, I mean, being willing to take a stand is a huge part of doing affirmative and inclusive therapy, but being willing to genuinely celebrate, not I'll pretend to celebrate you, but genuinely celebrating folks.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that advocacy piece that comes alongside, because there's like what happens in my office can stay in my four walls, right? And then like outside of that, like what that might look like, or what you've what you maybe hope it looks like for folks.
Yeah. I appreciate that distinction, Katie, because I really think about, I think affirmative therapy doesn't just happen in the therapy room. I've written enough with colleagues for years about this idea that we have to engage in an advocacy on a personal, professional, and political level. And I think that's what we're called to as therapists. And that was a controversial idea a decade ago, but I don't think it's as controversial for this new generation of therapists coming up. And so I think advocacy, we have to be willing to take stands in our personal life with the people that we love. We have to be willing to share with them when we choose to engage in affirmative celebratory therapy. We have to be willing to challenge those things in our personal sector that we hear that I know it's difficult, but what an opportunity to sit with those we love, to really to be congruent about what we do in our rooms with what we do with the people we love or are related to. Hopefully those things overlap, but sometimes they don't. And then we have to be willing to take some professional stands and ask things of our professional organizations, whether we're talking about MFT and CFR, as whatever people are involved in, and asking that those environments, those places be affirmative and celebratory. I know that there was about a decade in my career where I probably was writing the MFT board of directors maybe on a monthly basis about different things, particularly when we were working for the first statement from them. They made a statement on what was termed at that point reparative therapy. Just asking those things, but being willing to be in conversation as a professional. And then I think to do affirmative therapy, we have to be politically active. We have to know about the laws and policies in our state and our institutions that impact the day-to-day lives of our clients. I mean, I think our code of ethics calls us to do that. there's a substandard in our code of an AMFT code of ethics that calls us to be mindful of regulatory issues that might affect the therapy process. And I think a law saying that you can discriminate against someone based on their gender identity affects the therapy process, because it impacts all of our clients, whether they know it or not. And so we need to know about the laws and policies that are both in our institutions and in our states and in our country, and being willing to take a stand. Because when laws and policies hurt individuals or hurt relationships or hurt families, I don't think that fits with being a couple and family therapist. I think being willing to advocate. And so for me, I think training and to be a couple and family therapist is both about what you do in the room and out of the room to be an advocate for your clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're reminding me of the commentary I hear sometimes in research, but also with like, I do some teaching with our residency program here with family medicine residents, and they like the term social determinants of health. So when I hear you talking, like that's ringing in my head, right? These social determinants that impact health. And if I'm a healthcare provider, I should care about those social determinants that create the particular health outcome. We can't just be, here for the healing. We can be there for the prevention, or, sort of stopping upstream somewhere. I imagine that's what you're talking about, the ways that those policies or laws or the way transphobia or homophobia stigmatizes.
Most definitely. If I, for instance, let's say I'm working with a client that identifies as non-binary, and I'm working to help them develop a celebratory attitude, being able to take a celebratory stance with how they identify in terms of being non-binary. But I work and live in a state, as I do in North Dakota, that says you can be denied housing, that any landlord can deny you housing based on your gender identity. And I'm not aware of that. What risk am I bringing to my client? And at the same point, how helpful is therapy going to be if they leave my room where we have this celebratory attitude, but they step right outside and they can be kicked out of their housing?
Right.
And so for me, I will never be able to practice truly affirmative inclusive therapy in Fargo, North Dakota, until I get that law changed. And because I am focused on that, my legislators know me. I walk into a forum and they're like, "Oh, we're gonna have to talk about," but so we're gonna pass it, right? We're gonna change this because, well, in a state like mine, it doesn't take that many people, but there's only so many of us. But any of us can do that, right? Like I once submitted a question at a legislative forum, and they weren't allowing us to sign our names, otherwise they would have. And to be honest, it was read, and then one of the legislators on the panel said, "Oh, Christi McGeorge must be in the audience. Where are you, Christi?" And I raised my hand and waved, and then we had a discussion. But I think that level of because if I am committed to practicing affirmative therapy, but I can't in my state and for my trans, non-binary, genderqueer clients until I get this law changed.
Right.
Because how do you celebrate your identity and ask your family to do that with you, knowing you can lose your housing or your job?
Right. Right.
And we're not alone. This is not some weird North Dakota law. This is happening across our country. We're talking about at the end of 2019, there are 27 states. 2020 has been harder for me to keep track of for obvious reasons, but there are 27 states where gender identity could be used as a reason to deny housing and employment. 27 states.
Yeah, we're one of them here in Missouri.
Yeah. And so I don't know how, it's too simple if we think all we're going to worry about controlling is what happens in our four walls, in our offices. And then we send clients out into this world.
Yeah. In some ways, it seems antithetical to the founding theory or theories, right? Like if we're really thinking systemically, then we're really thinking systemically. We either are or we aren't, right? And so sometimes I feel like we artificially go, well, this is the end of my systemic influence. And it's just arbitrary. It's about my comfort, maybe, like my not wanting to be out there in some way or not thinking that's my place. But if we really think systemically, then it pushes us, I think, past where most other mental health professions
Right. Yeah, I mean, this was work we saw those that founded our field doing around certainly different populations. Their concern wasn't around those that with a marginalized sexual orientation or gender identity, but around other populations. This was this. So advocacy is at our heart.
Mm-hmm.
It's what ideally we should do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it allows us to be really congruent people, which is what we want for our clients. So that what we say in the room is what we do outside the room.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I completely, I mean, I work quite a bit with adolescents. And so like, I mean, hypocrisy is like the number one thing they have a sensitivity to. And so there's a lot like, are you who you say you are? I mean, I think that's a question a lot of clients have, particularly marginalized clients from marginalized groups, because, you know, I mean, they walk in and see me, cisgender white lady, like, you know, it's hard to know where people stand.
Yeah. And who you can trust.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always, I mean, based on the severity of what mental health professionals have done to queer communities, I'm so amazed at their bravery that they keep trusting us. Because we've done so much damage. Actually, a participant in one of my studies who's a pastor wisely said this to me once: Christi, the two populations that have done the most harm to LGBTQ communities are pastors and therapists. And who has in their code, who has in their central mission to be helpful? Pastors and therapists. And that was just a moment. That was just such a perfect articulation. And this is I sort of feel as this pastor feels, he feels it's his duty to stand for queer communities because he has to make, he's making repairs, right? He's doing it for all those pastors that did harmful things. And I think the same thing. I think as therapists, we're called to do that same sort of reparative work that historically and currently, I agree with him. I think we're one of the two most dangerous populations to queer communities.
Yeah.
If we're not really mindful and really make an effort.
Yeah. You're reminding me, I had someone say to me once, it was a queer young adult who said something to the effect of like, you know, you never know who you're walking into.
Yeah.
You know, like they have a license, they have a nice website or whatever, right? Like they sound nice, but I don't know who I'm talking to. And that's the trust part of the fear part, I'm sure.
And you think about that. I don't know about you, but anyone that's ever, when I've sought therapy, when others have sought therapy, we seek it typically at one of our most vulnerable times. A trauma has occurred, a stress has occurred, and we are vulnerably reaching out for help. And in that moment, if that licensed person doesn't reach back, or if that student therapist doesn't reach back in a way that honors that vulnerability and honors our personhood, how much damage could be done?
Right.
I mean, very few of us seek out therapy services when we're at our best.
Yeah, that's so.
Why would we?
Yeah, no, that's so true. Like people are calling for a reason, and that reason is usually pain of some kind. Yeah, no, that makes so much sense.
It makes we at NDSU once got a letter to the 3 CFT faculty, actually from a therapist. She was a licensed psychologist. Her wife was a licensed LMFT. They were out in the Southwest. And she wrote to thank us for what our clinic stood for and what our program stood for. She had found us searching because they had just had this experience. The psychologist, she tragically lost her mother, and she and her wife was also very close. Her mom was someone that fully accepted both of them and celebrated their marriage. And she and her wife had reached out to a therapist to do some grief work, because that's what we do when we receive, when such a tragic loss occurs. And she said they reached out to an LMFT because I thought that would who would be best trained to do that sort of family grief work with them. And something must have gotten lost. So they showed up for the first appointment, and the therapist realized they were two women, even though they had said that on the phone, but the therapist didn't even register it because what the therapist had written down was they were a married couple. And so they showed up for therapy as two women, one in LMFT. I mean, these are trained people. And the therapist refuses to see them and says, no, I don't work with, the phrase this therapist used was, I don't work with gay couples. And she wrote to us about the pain of that moment. That even as a professional, she's like, I'm in the mental health. My wife is an LMFT. This guy was an LMFT, and he refused to see us. And as they're dealing with this tragic death of her mother, an untimely death, she says, it just hurts so badly. And so I started Googling, and the first people I found, and we're in North Dakota, she's in the southwestern part of the United States. And so she just ends up writing us a thank you, just because we existed and had on a website that said we're LGBTQ affirmative. And this was, more than a decade ago, but I think of her every time. Like we think well, every time we have this discussion that therapists have a right to decide who they see. I think about this couple and in their pain, like they didn't need any more rejection. Right. They had suffered one of the greatest losses, as she would say in this letter, that they would ever experience. And then they had a door slammed on them by the person who was supposed to help them make sense of that grief.
Yeah. And what's buzzing in my head is like that person was perfectly trained to deal with loss and grief and a couple's relationship. And so it's not like that person couldn't have done the work. They were choosing not to because of how they felt or believed about a same gender couple.
Right. And in that moment, their sexual orientation wasn't the presenting problem. Their grief was the presenting problem.
Right.
And even if it was the presenting problem, they still should have been seen. But so often that's the case, is these are things we're trained to do and should be trained to do, because again, our competency doesn't lie in people. We're not incompetent to work with an entire group of people. Our competency, as you wisely said, Katie, relies in presenting issues, which any LMFT should have been prepared to address grief and loss.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you think about kind of sort of the arc of what's happening in our field and kind of where your work is going, where are you spending your time now? Where do you think sort of these sort of next iteration of questions? I mean, I hear this is still I know the stories from 10 years ago, but still an issue, still something we see in terms of referrals and refusal of service. And so is most of your work still there, or are there other places you're headed?
No, I mean, I want to be able to give up both the referral and the change efforts work. The day I no longer have to ask those questions will be a wonderful day. And so I hope before I retire, we get to a point where it's like, there's no need to research this because, we've banned these practices, we've made it unethical, we've adopted a definition of a discriminatory referral that includes referrals based on identities. And so I want to be able to move on. I think one of the things, one place my work has gone that maybe I wouldn't have anticipated if you'd asked me, is, as you referenced, Kitty, I've started interviewing religious leaders. And again, as someone who identifies as a person who does queer scholarship, I maybe didn't think I'd be there. I always believed that holding a queer, and I'm going to use the word queer here, just holding an LGBTQ identity, we'll go there, that's probably better, can exist with holding a religious identity. These things were never dichotomous or either or to me. I know the literature often presented them historically as a false dichotomy. You're either LGBTQ or you're religious, but there's not an overlap. It doesn't fit the data. We know a huge number of people who identify as LGBTQ also identify as religious. And so I knew that about the data. I just never thought this is where my research would take me. But the more and more I talk to clinicians, the reasons they were giving for doing the change efforts, the reasons they're giving for the referral or the refusal is their own personal religious beliefs. And I realized that no amount of data about the harm that I kept publishing and talking about was going to sway these people. And so as I started thinking, I needed to bring in different voices with some expertise that I could never have, right? I'm never going to be a religious leader. And I will never be a pastor and speak with that sort of authority. And so I started interviewing pastors about their ideas about referral, change efforts, general advice, how they approach working. And now, because in my research, I never want to lose the distinction and the overlap between sexual orientation and gender identity, I often take them individually because I don't want one to get lost. And often it's gender identity is my experience. And so this first round of studies was all focused on sexual orientation. My colleague Caitlin Coburn and I are preparing to start later next month, the next round of data collection. This will look at gender identity. But I find myself sitting with pastors and having a lot of conversation with pastors. And they have been brilliantly helpful and spoken about in ways that I wouldn't have anticipated. And they've been brave. While my first round of studies focused on kind of your mainland Protestant traditions, within that mainland Protestant tradition, there's a lot of discrepancy on beliefs. You can go from really affirming traditions to traditions that are so non-affirming, they'll take, we could say fire pastors or take their ordination, which is equivalent to firing them, if they profess these beliefs.
Right.
And so it's been interesting to have these conversations with these pastors and to bring a different set of voices into the conversation, and get their perspectives. And I didn't know what to anticipate. So like, I remember during the first series of several interviews, we were going to people's churches mainly because that's where it was easier for them. And so I'd go into these churches and I'd like bring different, like, what all will I need to define for them? Like, what do they know? And so I remember sitting across from one woman pastor and asking her, have you heard about this sexual orientation change efforts, or many people call them conversion or reparative therapy? And she looks at me and she says, yes, they're evil. And I said, because I'm all prepared. Like I brought a handout to like define, and she's like, I'm like, okay, let's just make sure we're talking about the same thing. Can you tell me what they are? And like, she defines sexual orientation change efforts like word for word for what's on. Don't give her my page. She just, I'm like, we're talking about the opposite, and you're like, no, it's where we change heterosexuals into gay people. I'm like, no, she knew it exactly.
Wow.
And she looks at me and could define them and explain them. And then she told me stories of members of her congregation who had experienced them.
Oh, wow.
The harm it did. And I remember, and I think you might have heard me share this quote, Katie, but I asked her, well, what do you want to tell those therapists that practice conversion therapy? And she says to me, just go work at Jiffy Lube. You should not be allowed to talk to people. Just go work at Jiffy Lube. And that was her, because the people that work at Jiffy Lube, because that's where she takes her car, don't have contact with her. Like she's like, they hire one person with people skills and the others just work on the cars. And they do a great job.
Yeah.
Up front.
Perfect.
And so she's like, I think therapists who practice conversion therapy should go work at Jiffy Lube. And I just thought I wasn't prepared for that sort of conversation because I didn't know, what. I mean, we're supposed to go into research often not knowing, but I really didn't know, like, what will I hear or talk about? And so potentially for a while now, I may find myself in this religious realm. After I redo this study around gender identity, I want to expand further out and talk to diverse leaders in diverse religious traditions, because I think it started with Christianity because, couple and family therapy is the most Christian mental health discipline by all data that's been collected. That's what we know. And so I was hoping to speak to my colleagues and have different voices speak to them and hope that some of these pastors, and I've seen that power. 4 of the pastors traveled with me to do a panel at a conference, and the room was packed. And I don't think people cared one word what I said. I don't think it mattered. And I was very aware of that, didn't need that. But these pastors spoke to these therapists and talked to them about, and I think it was a probably pretty new experience. I mean, this wasn't a Christian conference we went to a kind of traditional conference. But they talked about why they support affirmative therapy for in that case, we were talking about LGB people.
Right.
And they spoke with such passion. And one of them told a powerful story about a youth that committed suicide. That just broke his heart because and he tells this story beautifully. And I think I watched these clinicians look in a little bit of shock, because some of them I think came to the session thinking that these pastors would be more moderate, that they would kind of say like, yeah, it's okay, it's a sin, but, or something like that. And these pastors weren't there. That's not what they were about. They had a really different message. And I hope that it touched some clinician in a way that no matter how I collect my data and no matter how many ways I try to say some of the same things those pastors said that day through my data, that it falls on different ears. And so, yeah. So I think it's still my scholar advocacy work, but I think I find myself in the realm of religiosity for a while.
Welcome to my world. So I feel like I should tell you, I'm a pastor's kid. Like those are my people. But I think when I hear you describe that, it sounds really powerful in the sense that like you're bringing people who have authority on a subject to other people who see that authority as relevant and going, you tell them. Like I've been trying to say it. I don't have the power and influence that you have. And so you sort of, through your research, empowered them to become another voice with you, to even like speak in a religious language. Because I think part of it is language, and there's therapist language and there's religious language and there's other, and it's all English, but it's still, it will hit different. It will sound different. And so I have to imagine that was part of it.
It's completely part of it. Is they can speak with an authority, a language. I mean, like, I remember one of the pastors on the panel said, yeah, if anyone wants to play quiz the pastor on Bible verses because you think you can justify a marginalization of queer people because of the Bible, you're going to lose, but let's play the game. Because she's like, I got my Latin, my Greek, and my English Bible up here, and pretty much I've memorized all of them. So whatever you want to talk about, I'm ready. But they also have a really compassionate way. It's been interesting. They are partners in this work in real, I mean, as someone who often, particularly when I do qualitative research, I try to do it when I do quantitative research, but it doesn't work as well. I'm using feminist methodologies. And so, they give me feedback on their transcript. They read every paper before it's submitted. They read every proposal, every presentation. If they're not traveling with me, then they of course read them before if they're traveling with me, but even if they're not going, they read every presentation, everything goes to them. And they email back, and that just fits good feminist methodology, right? That's member checking at its essence. But it's been interesting that they've become so invested. That they, I mean, they've just given feedback on their 4th paper, and they are just so invested and interested. And so I think that I also didn't expect. All my partners in research have been my collaborators or my students. And certainly I've always tried to engage in member checking and some of those other pieces, but these people are so.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds like another level of that. Like, I've been doing a lot of qualitative research with the member checking, but what I hear you doing is kind of like member checking plus, the community participatory research model, but at the level, like, these are their voices, and you want to be sure that you're representing them right, and they get to have input on that, and then they get to show up with you in the way that they want to. They have a choice about that.
Exactly, in the way and so they all have a synonym, a pseudonym, a pseudonym we use in the paper, because for some of them, if the person above them, often in some of that language is bishop, it varies based on, found out that they were participating, that some of them could lose their jobs.
Right.
And so but yet, even some of those whose jobs are in a really risky place, have chosen to go out on the panels and have decided that if they lose their ordination, for a couple of them have, one in particular has made that choice. And he says, I don't know how I live with myself if I don't speak. But we've taken, and so they're funny. They really have great ideas. And I want to make sure I don't hold myself up as any sort of, I've learned a lot, but no, I'm no religious scholar. And so I never want to be presenting things or using the wrong words or language. And so I think they really help me, because I need to translate their language to a scholarly language, but I also need to honor their language and make sure it's in that article, or in presentations. I think it's even more important that their language supersedes any sort of scholarly language.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, this sort of translating of a participant's language into something that translates to our field or people reading it, but then how not to misrepresent it in the process. But you want people to understand it. I mean, it always feels like such a dilemma, right, between the two, to make sure you're sort of honoring both. And then ironically, even though we, like, as membership in AMFT, lots of religious folks, I don't know how well religion or spirituality has been talked about with like, it feels like it's the water we swim in, but not necessarily always as visible. I don't know how you feel about that, but when I've done some writing on religiosity, like for one of our journals, I always feel like I'm trying to translate to help people understand, because we're not, I don't know if that's your experience. We're just it's not as talked about.
No, I really don't think it is. And I think at its best, spirituality or religiosity can be a huge resource. And it also can be a huge source of harm, whether you're part of the LGBTQ communities or for another reason. And so I think we as therapists need to be able to talk about it and figure out how it can be a resource and help people process any harm that came through it. But you're right, as a discipline, we have a very interesting relationship. When it's convenient, we often point to therapists' personal beliefs as a reason.
Yes.
In my area, as a reason, like, oh no, we can't ask people to change their religious beliefs to service these particular clients. We need to figure out how to talk about it and how to add it to our trainings and talk about it at our conferences.
So you're working with a lot of pastors, which you never expected to land in. And it sounds like, in terms of your research methodology over time, things have changed, or you've continued to innovate in a way that allowed you to be an advocate, also inform therapy practice. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's very fair. I think it's been really, I think the research has formed the therapy, and the therapy has informed the research.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Wonderful. So any closing thoughts you have for sort of new MFTs, or things you hope that they have heard loud and clear about, maybe some of your central messages you want to get across from your own research and work, and as an educator and a supervisor and all of those things?
My hope is that Self as a Therapist work continues beyond learning about your genogram. And a lot of times in our training programs, we get students to make a genogram. We have a good discussion about the genogram, and then we think Self as a Therapist work is done.
Yeah.
For me, Self as a Therapist work is a day-to-day, lifelong commitment. If you choose to do this work, we have to be exploring all those messages that we've received since childhood about the superiority of heterosexual cisgender identities and the inferiority, and I don't believe this, but this is what we were taught, the inferiority of LGBTQ identities. And so I think we need to explore those. And that may, for those of us, myself included, who grew up within religious homes that may involve exploring what we learned in those religious homes. What did our houses of worship teach us? What did if we belong to a religious group that has a sacred text, what does that text teach us?
Right.
We say that the religious home we grew up, the religious worshiping community we grew up in was silent. Then what did that silence teach us?
Right.
But we need to be doing some really active work to bring these unconscious beliefs forward so that they can be conscious. We can interrogate them, we can deconstruct them, we can decide if we want them to influence our therapy. I stand here as someone who's deeply committed to doing affirmative and inclusive work with my LGBTQ colleagues, friends, and clients. But at the same point, I have was bathed since in vitro with heterosexist, sexist beliefs,
Right.
and they come out, and I have to keep doing work. So whether that's, I always joke when I'm training therapists, like, how many of you recommend someone journal lately? When's the last time you journaled? And of course, everyone raises their, I mean, who's signed a client in the past week to journal, in the past month, who's journaled themselves, and so we need to figure out how to get these ideas out, get them in, if it's journaling, if it's working with what I've termed an accountability partner. Typically, I think of that as someone who holds that same dominant identity as me, who will help me initially work through some things. So I could take my heterosexist beliefs and behaviors to my LGB colleagues and do more harm to them, or I can sit with another heterosexual person and talk about them and be held accountable, whether it's bringing it up in supervision or consultation. But self-led therapist work, something we were founded on, that somehow it got simplified into, have you done your genogram? Would you do your genogram? That's still a piece. That's not enough. I think we have to constantly be working on ourselves, because we know the research. The research says, we can talk about theory, technique, all of these things, but the biggest percentage of therapeutic change comes from who we are and how we relate and join with our clients. And so, we don't get to say that's personal as therapists. I'm not going to look at that idea because it's personal, because whether I'm a feminist and say the personal is political, or whether I am a therapist and say the personal comes into your room, it oozes out of us.
Right.
We know better. We can't wall off certain beliefs or certain ideas.
Right.
Like, I'll think this in my personal life, but I'll be this way in therapy. It doesn't work. And so I think self-led therapist work has to continue. And if we do good self-led therapist work, then I think we'll get at the root of why maybe if there's some of us that want to refer or don't want to see LGBTQ clients, I think we'll get at that root and we'll be able to distinguish it. Because if you're not willing to see all clients based on their identities, I'm not saying we're experts on all presenting problems, but if you're not willing to see all clients based on their identities, you may not be called to this work. Because being a couple and family therapist is a privilege. It's not a right. And part of that privilege is saying our code of ethics says we don't discriminate based on identities. And so I think that has to be part of that conversation. I think ultimately all of my work seems to keep coming back to self-led therapist.
Well, and it sounds like in staying in that work. So it's not the one and done, or, periodically if you have an egregious action, it's sort of like this consistent, reflective, maybe consultation relationship you need to be in with yourself and others. That way you don't burden folks in those marginalized communities with your stuff, with your, with all that terrible water you've been drinking you didn't realize was terrible. But it's constant effort, essentially. And maybe a willingness to see it on some level, or
a real willingness. I think I like that, Katie. It has to be a willingness to see it, because I'm not saying, like, when we engage in heterosexist behaviors or endorse heterosexist beliefs, for instance, we're not bad people. We're just human beings. But if we leave those beliefs or behaviors to be uninterrogated, and so this is about being a bad person. Good people do these things, and then good people own them and they make amends for it. I'm happy and they pay me, but I will tell very specific stories on myself of things that I have done that break my heart, but I did them. And it's heartbreaking thinking about what I do for a living, what my passion is, what I do on my down, but these are the behaviors I've engaged in and I'm trying. And I can't undo those behaviors, but I can own them and I can work on not doing them again. And it doesn't make me a bad person for having done them. But if I refuse to own them, if I refuse to look at them, if I refuse to make changes, that's when we have to worry about my character, not that I first engaged in them. Right. I will always have heterosexual blind spots and six gender blind spots, and we could expand out and talk about my white blind spot. I will always have these things, and I'm grateful to Joe Wetchler for coining the term. I will always have heterosexual blind spots, but how big they are in my control.
Right.
And I can work to diminish them.
Right. Right. Yeah. That sounds really important. Like how big they are, where they are, how long they last in our lives. Like that's on us.
Yeah.
That's our work to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. That sounds really, really important. Well, I really appreciate your time and your expertise and all the things you're going to be bringing to my students now that they get to hear from you. Particularly, like I think about this, the long arc of MFT work, and sometimes, like with the newest generation, you want to help them understand the context, right, the history, and how far we've come and how much more work is done. And so, I really appreciate you talking through that and kind of where you are now. I've been an admirer of your work since I was a master's student. Just a couple of years ago. No.
So kind.
So
how did I get this?
I have the same question all the time. Like I feel like I had it yesterday. So thank you so much, and carry on. I'm really excited about what's next. What you're going to find next, and now I want to figure out how I get to see you on a panel with those pastors. That sounds awesome.
Oh, they're amazing. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity, for this wonderful conversation, and for all your commitment and hard work creating a socially just CFT community. So thank you.
Got it. I can't not do it. I just feel that way about it.